So I'm going to now introduce our guest speaker for this evening. Is Dr. Ross Mittiga, who's Assistant Professor of Political Theory in the Catholic University of Chile's Institute of Political Science. He's been hosted by the Centre for Sustainability, Equality and Climate Action over the next couple of days. And Ross's areas of interest is very relevant to what we're seeing now in terms of if you lose your shit because activists in Just Stop Oil are throwing tomato over a Van Gogh painting that they absolutely knew was not going to be damaged, I would humbly say you're reading too much of the Daily Mail and you have your priorities wrong. How is it we protect these valuable human artifacts and yet we're not protecting the life-supporting systems of the planet? That's the point. Of course, we can debate as whether or not that's an effective tactic. But in a way, that's what Ross's research is around. That, in part, without stealing his thunder in many respects, but the reason why I like Ross's work is that are we coming to the end of the nicey phase of resistance to the climate crisis? I've been on the radio, as I always am at these COP. I'm once again an overnight success after 30 years crying in the wilderness. And what I'm saying on the radio the last few days about COP is this. We've had 26 other COPs. Well, now it's COP 27. In that period, well, it's a little bit longer, in the last 50 years or so, over half of all greenhouse gas emissions ever emitted since 1751, that's the point when we say the Industrial Revolution began, over half of all emissions have been emitted in that period. So while we have the COPs going on, we also have greenhouse gas emissions increasing. We see an ever increasing frustration amongst sections of our population, as expressed by Extinction Rebellion, Just Stop Oil, Insulate Britain, the young people striking for the climate. But will we now see perhaps movements beyond that? I'm sure it's something Ross will touch upon because it's certainly a live topic within the academic stroke activist community. Will we start blowing up pipelines? Is that the next stage? Because historically, most major changes in society, the abolition of slavery, as I was mentioning yesterday in relation to another talk Ross gave, we tend to think the narrative about the abolition of slavery in Britain is that some nice Protestant religious people suddenly came around and seen black people as equal, and it was a terrible blight on the British Empire and civilization to have the slave trade. That is true. William Wilberforce, for example, is the one that most will remember as one of the leaders in the abolition. What we tend to forget, it took the violent revolution in Haiti of slaves in Haiti who rose up against their French colonial oppressors that actually also hastened the abolition of slavery. Polite women did not get the vote. There was violence associated with the suffragette movement. Even the unfinished, journey for African Americans to have equality and civil rights, that was accompanied by violence. For a Martin Luther King, we also needed a Malcolm X. So the issue here is, will we see a similar progress, perhaps, in the climate crisis? As I was reflecting yesterday, because as most of you know, I'm an unabashed Marxist, or a Marxist-Lentilist, watermelon green on the outside, out the middle. If you read Marx on his analysis of the emergence of capitalism, he has this very evocative phrase in his great volume, Capital. Don't read it sober. It's far too long. And make more fun when you're a bit tipsy. Where he says, capitalism enters the world dripping from every pore in blood and sweat and toil. So it enters the world in terms of dispossession, violence, colonialism, imperialism, primitive accumulation of resources and people. So that's how it entered the world. And if, as I do, we have to see that a sustainable future is not just one beyond carbon, it's not just one beyond consumerism, there's also one beyond at least the current structure of capitalism. Does that mean that the exit of capitalism from the world stage will also be accompanied by violence? This is not to advocate violence. It's simply to say we are not making enough progress. It's clear from that trajectory I've given you in terms of a lot of talk. You know, just look at that Aegis, Rishi Sunak. He goes to COP because he's shamed into it for fear that Bojo is going to go, and of course Bojo goes anyway. But the bow Rishi rocks up, flies in and out. What does he come away from COP26 with? A gas deal with America. What? WTF? You're going there and you're saying hand-wringing, liberal moralizing. Oh, it's a terrible crisis. The young people, taking the children, taking the children. And goes away with a deal with Sleepy Joe Biden on a gas deal. What do we do with that as citizens? Are we prepared to sit back and just accept it, or what do we do? So it is my great pleasure to welcome Ross, who I think in his talk tonight will help us answer the most important question we need to answer today from that other Marxist, Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, 120 years ago. It's the question of what is to be done. So I'm going to ask you all to give Ross a very warm welcome.
One experiment. Thank you all very much for being here tonight. Thank you especially to John Barry for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to speak with you all, especially about this because it's very new and very experimental material for me. So basically, the subject of my talk is a really fun and happy one, which is what kind of political response is going to be needed to prevent full-blown catastrophe and collapse. So in other words, what I want to talk to you all about is political strategy with an aim to get clear about what kind of struggle we're in for in the years ahead, assuming that radical change does not happen by some other means. Now, as many of you will no doubt be aware, when discussing this very same topic, many political leaders, many journalists, many activists, and even some academics invoke the language of war and warfare. There's really a million examples here. This one's from a march in San Diego. I like the expression, World War I, World War II, World War CO2. But there's just an endless array of examples. Here's Al Gore, former Vice President of the United States. Here's Jerry Brown, former governor of California, which, as many often point out about California, would be on its own the 8th largest economy in the world. Here's poor old Ed Miliband calling for a wartime mobilization. A couple years back, the New York progressive AOC gave a talk saying that climate change is like our World War II. And recently, Nobel Prize-winning economist Joseph Stiglitz said that climate change is like our Third World War. But perhaps the most famous, and I would say most provocative example of this is still Bill McKibben's 2016 article, A World at War. Now, I say this is provocative because McKibben drops any pretense of analogizing in that article, and he instead says plainly, but nonetheless forcefully, that climate change is, and I quote here, not like a world war, it is a world war. Literally. Now, as with many things McKibben, however, this was more rhetorical radicality than anything else, in the sense that his ultimate point was much the same as nearly everybody else who likens climate change to war, which is to argue that climate change is already devastating, will only become more so, and our only shot at preventing a ghastly future is if states undertake a massive mobilization of resources on a par with that which occurred during the World Wars, but this time aimed at retooling the ways in which we produce energy, in which we travel, and in which we eat. And this is no doubt true. As the IPCC has itself made clear repeatedly, the IPCC is the world's most authoritative governing body on climate change. They're the ones that release all the reports. They said nothing short of, quote, unprecedented change, which means, in their words, deep emissions reductions in all sectors of society will give us a decent shot, not a guarantee, of averting catastrophe. Now, well, McKibben's argument, and those like McKibben, is maybe more sanitized than it should be. In general, I think that we should welcome this way of framing the problem because it provides a sense of agency. It suggests that in the war against climate change, we are each of us foot soldiers of sustainability, engaged in a battle for a livable planet, and importantly, a battle that we can win. On top of this, invocations of a war against climate change helpfully center, I think, the public conversation on considerations of power rather than justice. The operant idea is not that we have a moral duty to take action on climate change, though that we have moral duties in this vein is often assumed or expressed in some form. Rather, the idea is that we can and we must fight against climate catastrophe as a matter of survival. As Greta Thunberg once put it, as if our lives depended on it, because they do. Still, in its ordinary formulation, the climate war analogy leaves a lot unstated and ambiguous. Identifying and examining those ambiguities is more or less the substantive focus of my talk today. That said, like a typical good-for-nothing philosopher, I will probably be leaving you all with more questions than answers. But my hope is that these questions can give us, help us to have a sense of how we might develop the climate war analogy a bit more, push it in a potentially more illuminating direction, potentially more galvanizing direction, because I do think there's something valuable in this way of understanding our predicament. In particular, I think the idea that climate change confronts us as a kind of war actually holds up in a more literal sense than most recognize, or perhaps would feel comfortable recognizing. And if that's true, if climate change is, in a sense, war, then we have to think carefully about what follows. Now, to get started in this, I think the first question is, how exactly does climate change qualify as a war? Like, what makes it warlike? I think the most natural way to respond to this question is simply to consider some of the ordinary features of wars and see if there's any correlates in the climate sense. This and many of the pictures I have on here, I actually generated through that AI painting thing. I just typed in climate change war and it came up with a lot of crazy images. It's just fun fact. Okay, so what are some of the ordinary features of wars? Well, one is territory loss. Now, on the side here, I'm including facts that link climate change to these factors. In I think every case here, the sources of these facts are the United Nations, the IPCC, or peer-reviewed empirical scientific articles. So not just statements of opinion, I guess. The territory loss, that's an ordinary feature of a war, also something we're seeing with climate change. Forced displacement or involuntary migration. According to this, an average of 22.5 million people have been displaced each year by weather and climate-related disasters since 2008. This is a number that's only going to get bigger. Destruction of cultures and communities, including historical artifacts. I think this is something that's just starting to be understood in a serious way with respect to climate change. Serious damage to property and the economic life of a people. I love these economic estimates of the damages of climate change. Like, what's the cost of losing all of civilization? Roughly 8% GDP. Okay. Massive externally imposed suffering. Well, the UN this year said untold human suffering is in the near future. Wide-scale human rights abuses, according to the UN, is now beyond dispute that climate change is going to have negative impacts on the full enjoyment of human rights. This significant amount of preventable death. Now, I think this last one is really important, and I think not widely acknowledged enough with respect to climate change. Here's a study from Lancet with just a ton of authors, really widely discussed. About a year ago, they said they traced, they found that about 5,083,173 deaths a year occur that could be associated with non-optimal temperatures related to climate change. They have a 95% confidence interval on this. Another study came out a few years ago, predicted that the pollution that causes climate change, so not climate change itself, just the pollution that's generating climate change, the fine particulate matter, caused 8.9 million additional deaths in 2015. World Health Organization, climate change is the biggest health threat facing humanity, and estimates that it's going to cause an additional 250,000 deaths per year, every year between 2030 and 2050. Now, I said last night that I mentioned a couple of these numbers. Let's just assume that they are wildly off, that these are completely like insane statistics. They're 90% off. We're still talking about hundreds of thousands of unnecessary deaths every year. Now, on top of all of this, we can add another feature of war in the contemporary nuclear age, which is the looming risk of complete annihilation, which is to say the extinction of all or nearly all life on the planet, or at least the collapse of the grand ramparts of human civilization. Now, the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences just published, I think, a really helpful short article summarizing the very quickly expanding literature on this topic, which I'd recommend checking out. But there's quite a lot of studies now that show climate change runs a real risk of complete civilizational collapse. Now, even taking all this into account, though, that's not really enough to call climate change war, because there's at least one very important thing missing here. War is not defined solely in relation to harm, and to loss, and to death and destruction, to bad effects. War's also about conflict, right? It's fundamentally a violent struggle between two or more discrete parties. In war, there are allies and there are enemies, there are moves and counter moves. So this leads us to our second major question. If climate change is like a war, who are the enemy combatants? Now, among those like McKibben, also AI, or AOC, among those people who basically have made the climate war analogy, the implied response to this, or sometimes the direct response to this question, is just that climate change itself is the enemy. But of course, that doesn't make any sense, does it? Physics is not and cannot be our enemy. It is not an agent. Climate change is a destructive force, to be sure, but it doesn't have any intentions or desires. It's just brute chemical reaction, geophysical process, meteorological cause and consequence. In this sense, calling climate change the enemy is just a kind of rhetorical ploy. It's a kind of ginger sidestepping of an ugly and uncomfortable truth. But I think there's another way of looking at this. Even though climate change is obviously not itself an enemy or an agent of harm, it can plausibly be regarded as an implement of warfare. That is, as a means for unjustly harming and killing other people, undermining their most basic rights, violating the integrity of their territories, and so on. On this view, climate change is basically a weapon of mass destruction, itself much more like a nuke than an enemy army. So then we come back to this question. Who are the aggressors in this conflict? Well, one possibility, the least fun possibility, is that it's just all of us. At least those of us who are emitting more than our fair share of the carbon budget, and unnecessarily so. But of course, a lot of our emissions, we individuals, are in a sense inertial. They're products of a vast system designed and maintained by others that's difficult or impossible to escape. I doubt that any of you here today would choose to emit more than you have to. And probably most of you actively seek ways to diminish your carbon footprint, perhaps even while publicly maintaining that individuals are not to blame so much as corporations or the system, right? But if that's right, then again, who are the aggressors? Well, I think a principled way to answer this is offered by what is sometimes called the power responsibility principle, or what we might call the Spider-Man principle. The Spider-Man principle holds quite plausibly, I think, that those who have the most power to change things have the greatest responsibility for the way that things are. Note that this does not completely let us off the hook, especially those of us who continue to, I don't know, eat animal products or fly when we don't have to, or buy SUVs or whatever, all while kind of blithely maintaining that changes must be made. While it's of course true that voluntary individual change is not an effective path to preventing climate catastrophe, it's also equally true there is no form of system change that does not entail significantly altering individual choices and behaviors. And after all, just as each of us can say, each of us can excuse ourselves, so too can every company say, I would change were it not, for the competition of others. And likewise, every state can and often does say, I would impose carbon taxes were it not for the possibility of outsourcing. And so on, ad absurdum, all the way until we kind of blamelessly jump off the cliff to catastrophe. Now, there are deeper questions here, I think, about the extent to which any particular agent can be said to have meaningful agency in a global capitalist system. But even accepting this, again, there are clearly some actors who possess great power, much more power than others. A small minority of the global population who design and maintain the machine in which we all eat, sleep, pray, and die. These people set the terms of the game that we all have to play. And so if blame can fall anywhere, surely it would fall most of all there. Now, here I have in mind the usual culprits, the mega corporations, or in particular the boards and the CEOs who run them, certain politicians and media personalities, all of whom have the power to reform the system, or failing that, at least the power to advocate for reform, or failing that, at least the power to accept reform measures when presented to them, but who nevertheless fight tirelessly against any change. Now, a familiar and very clear case in point here is that of Exxon, who learned of the nature and extent of the problem well before most, and yet deliberately chose not to change. Exxon certainly could have pursued other business activities after learning about the harm that fossil fuels were doing. And they actually did consider this. They did consider, for instance, developing electric cars and renewable energy. Instead, though, they opted to double down, to expand their harmful operations and invest heavily and for decades in a disastrous but highly effective disinformation and electioneering campaign that protected their profits at the cost of concerted political action, particularly by the US. But of course, Exxon's not a singular example here. Many and perhaps all fossil fuel companies have a similarly dark history. Likewise, many politicians, especially those in the mega economies, the US, the EU, China, India, Brazil, Russia, and a handful of others, are at the very least complicit in these crimes, if not guilty of actively abetting them. And of course, often enough, these politicians are directly on the payrolls of the agents that are meant to regulate and restrain. Moreover, these agents of injustice, I guess we can call them the carbon axis of evil. The carbon axis, they have their propagandists, their lawyers, general sycophants, the talking heads and the morally vacant bureaucrats who are always engaging in the kind of more banal forms of evil, and often only for peanuts. Now, these people and entities, we can say, are well and truly blameworthy. There's no doubt there. They are aware of the problem. And even in the austere and unforgiving light of that awareness, have continued to act as they have always done, needlessly. They not only have the power to change and have chosen not to, but have again forcefully resisted any reforms being imposed on them externally. Now, somebody might insist here that the folks comprising what I'm calling the carbon axis do not directly intend to cause the very great evils that we're already beginning to experience. Or at the very least, this is not their primary intention. They're just trying to supply the world with energy and meat and cheap transportation. Climate change is just, I don't know, an unfortunate side effect of otherwise legitimate activities. Even if we grant this, though, I'm not really sure how much exculpatory force really has. At least it's not obvious to me that the suffering, the death, and the damage that the carbon axis is undeniably causing is made any less morally offensive or condemnable for the mere fact that it's just a byproduct of other activities. Activities that, of course, nobody pretends are noble. It's not as if they're killing people in an attempt to cure all diseases or to colonize Mars or something like this. Their primary ends are essentially just accreting more and more personal wealth come what may. And worse still, these side effects, which again, side effects that may well include the extinction of all or most animal life and the end of human civilization, when these side effects are acknowledged, which has only really recently been the case, they're routinely met with, at best, shoulder-shrugging indifference and a strong insistence that nothing can really change. And yet the carbon axis has always had alternatives, perhaps less lucrative ones, but avoiding a dip in shareholder profits is not, to my mind at least, sufficient moral cover for killing people and devastating the natural world. Ultimately, I think we could just as reasonably think that this element, this kind of feature, characteristic of climate warming, that it's not the primary or intentional ends of those causing it. I think that could just as well be construed, could make the activities even more repulsive to moral feeling in the human soul. And of course, this is if they even acknowledge the harm that they're causing. For a very long time, they simply lied and sought to cover up the truth. And this, too, is not a bloodless affair. According to one very recent report, more than 1,700 environmental activists have been killed just in the past decade, which is about one activist every 2 days. Who do we think is responsible for those deaths? Now, still, someone might grant that everything that I've been saying up to this point, and still ask, why should we treat the misdeeds of the carbon axis as crimes, or maybe even more strongly, crimes against humanity? Why would war be the appropriate framework? Why isn't this just a crime? Certainly people, including some very smart political theorists like Katrina McKinnon, have proposed doing just this. But I'm skeptical of this approach for one big reason. That kind of justice, I think, requires power. Tribunals overseeing cases of crimes against humanity often only occur after the wrongdoers have been overthrown and defeated. It's a kind of justice that follows victory. And of course, right now, those very same wrongdoers, again, the carbon axis, I'm in love with this phrase, they have the reins of power tightly in their grips. And given their track record so far, I would say that pretty unlikely they're going to subject themselves to judgment unless they're forced to do so. Now, to be clear, when I say the carbon axis is in control, I don't mean this in a conspiratorial sense, but really quite literally. Many of the biggest petrol companies are state-owned. In many cases, important politicians owe their power to the aid of fossil fuel, transportation, and agricultural companies' donations. They're lobbyists. In many more cases still, those same lobbyists and executives are gifted control of regulative agencies, like for instance, the United States forever with the USDA, the department that oversees agriculture, or recently, a lot of times, the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. A lot of times, control of those agencies is given as a form of patronage and protection for those businesses. Sometimes these executives and lobbyists are even made into top diplomats with enormous global power. The most clear and egregious example here is when Exxon's CEO, Rex Tillerson, was appointed to lead the US State Department under Trump. But even now, with Biden, his Treasury Secretary, who has an enormous amount of power, Janet Yellen, she presents herself as a climate leader. But she also, in her disclosure forms, turned out she has quite a lot of fossil fuel stocks and has received millions in speaking fees from many of the banks that she's supposed to regulate and that continue to finance fossil fuel development. But really, the problem is even more acute than this. Governments today are far more likely to pass laws criminalizing resistance to fossil fuel harms, to carbon harms, than signalizing those very misdeeds. Consider the rash of new terrorism laws in the United States, which are meant to scare people away from closing down oil pipelines or disrupting fossil fuel extraction. Or in the UK, there was an attempted move that attracted a lot of criticism. They walked it back, but they tried to designate Extinction Rebellion as an extremist organization. Now, these moves, I think, reflect the current balance of power and how that balance of power can contort justice. They also, and I think more worryingly, suggest that a very great number of existing state governments, especially those of the mega polluters, are falling every day more deeply into a real legitimacy crisis. 30 years of inaction, of subterfuge, of underwriting, and more widely aiding and abetting carbon farming has, in the eyes of many people, undermined any reasonable capacity, any reasonable belief in their ability or willingness to protect us from the ravages of the climate crisis. And if governments fail at this most essential task, how can they be considered legitimate? This sense of eroded legitimacy perhaps never seemed clearer to me. Never seemed clearer to me than when the IPCC announced recently that there was simply no credible pathway to 1.5 degrees warming in place. In other words, that states had failed to even propose, let alone implement measures that could limit warming to 1.5 Celsius. A threshold that they have all explicitly agreed to, and for some time, in which scientists have designated as the most warming we can allow without all but guaranteeing truly catastrophic changes. For me, this failure constitutes an enormous betrayal of public trust, and it makes plain the ruling class's essential disinterest in, if not active antipathy toward, securing our well-being, that of the planet, that of our fellow earthlings, other animals, and that of future generations. So now we're faced with some questions of despair. What can we do when our governments are actively harming us, or at least allowing and often even facilitating harm being done to us, while criminalizing resistance to the sources of that harm? What can we do when our governments have been co-opted, colonized, bought, and paid for, such that the catastrophic and short-sighted desires of carbon capitalists are always privileged ahead of even the most basic public interests? Or perhaps even more bluntly, more to the point, what is to be done when the political structures we have erected to safeguard us in the future have been seized by enemy forces? The answer to these questions, I think, tells us something about the type of war that climate change presents us with. When political power is held by villains and their accomplices, while we, the great many, the overwhelming global majority, are made victims of their illegitimate reign and were made criminals underneath it, it seems to me that the stage is set for revolutionary struggle, as horrifying as that might be. And to be clear, revolution is always a dangerous idea and even more dangerous undertaking. But when the unjust are rulers and the just are criminals, the only way to move forward may be to invert the whole structure. And precisely this seems to be getting underway just now. Think about the climate disobedience campaigns that have been exploding in scale and frequency over the last 5 years, perhaps really nowhere more than here in the UK. It's hard for me to see these as anything but a response to gross illegitimacy, the beginnings of an uprising. Because when citizens, ordinary citizens, increasingly feel compelled to break the law in order to prevent harm, especially harms that reasonably could be avoided by governmental action, but simply are not, clearly something profound is amiss. Note, though, that so far, at least, resistance has been relatively civil. Disruptive at times, to be sure, but tame. That might not last for long, however, if those at the helm don't start redirecting the ship of state toward calmer seas. For already now, today, activists are not only seeking to communicate the gravity of the climate crisis to their fellow citizens, but to themselves, intervene directly and stop harms by throwing their bodies on the wheels and the levers of carbon power, by blocking fuel shipments, by liberating animals from factory farms, by preventing the construction of new highways and airports, by tree sitting in the paths of pipelines, and so on. That these interventions have been at least partially effective is evinced by the mad rush to designate these activities as forms of terrorism and arrest those involved en masse. You don't have to have a PhD in history to know that overreactions to peaceful protests reek of fear, right? And yet, despite attempts at oppression, disobedience only continues to grow louder, more common, bolder. And my strong sense is that the still quite civil forms of harm prevention disobedience that we're seeing emerge around us right now, those are just a prelude to more radical interventions and perhaps rebellion or revolution. Now, something like this is suggested in the speeches and the publications of many disobedient groups. Here's the Climate Disobedience Center. They have a big, long statement of the right to resistance on their website, but among other things, it argues that popular consent is the predicate of democratic governance and may be revoked when the institutions of government have lost their allegiance to the public. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights asserts that the people have recourse as a last resort to rebellion against tyranny and oppression. This resistance is justified by the extreme and existential threat of climate change to all human and non-human life. They're not alone. The Extinction Rebellion has similar language in their Declaration of Rebellion. They say when government and the law fail to provide any assurance of adequate protection, as well as security for its people well-being and the nation's future, it becomes the right of its citizens to seek redress in order to restore dutiful democracy and to secure the solutions needed to avert catastrophe and protect the future. We hereby declare the bonds of the social contract to be null and void, which the government has rendered invalid by its continuing failure to act appropriately. Again, as the climate crisis deepens and future prognostications grow ever more dire, we can only expect proclamations like these to grow more radical and to be more widely repeated. And already, now, today, calls for bolder action are being met with considerable, if still cautious interest, as with Andreas Malm's treatise, How to Blow Up a Pipeline. Increasingly commonplace, too, are vivid imaginings of overtly violent interventions like the oil executive assassinations and private jet bombings described in Kim Stanley Robinson's semi-dystopian climate novel Ministry of the Future, for the Future. Hell, even the popular cartoon Rick and Morty had an episode depicting a frustrated eco-superhero who in a moment of despair, quickly transition from like extinguishing, in a friendly way, forest fires to slashing tires on gridlocked highways, killing hundreds of apathetic coal miners, and setting fire to a corrupt, fossil-friendly congressperson's house. So these ideas are already in the public imagination. And all of this, I think, speaks to Hannah Arendt's observation that civil disobedience, which is what we're experiencing now, springs from the same source as revolution. She says a disintegration of political systems precedes revolutions. And the telling symptom of disintegration is a progressive erosion of governmental authority caused by the government's inability to function properly, from which spring doubts, the citizens' doubts about its legitimacy.
Excuse me, who did you say that is?
Hannah Arendt. Now, the evidence of our government's inability to function properly is contained in 30 years of scientific reports and broken treaties. And that we all have doubts about the legitimacy of the status quo is evinced by the fact that we gathered here together in this room tonight. Why waste your Tuesday listening to some guy from far away talk to you about climate war? So what is to be done? Well, given the enormous stakes involved in preventing climate catastrophe and collapse, and the rapidly closing time window we have for accomplishing this, we must begin to acknowledge that more radical forms of resistance may be necessary and justified. And once we accept this, we must each of us begin to expand our tactical and strategic imaginations. In other words, we must think now about what revolutionary change must look like and will require from us, about what it will take to win the war against the carbon axis. I think this requires a kind of reflection that's both moral and prudential. It falls not just to political theorists now, but to each and every one of us to consider what are the limits of what we can do to other people, and not just those who are responsible, but to our fellow citizens. What can we demand of other people in terms of sacrifice and understanding? What can we demand of each other? What are the limits of solidarity? Perhaps most pressingly, what role must each of us play in this conflict? What are we willing to risk or to give up in order to succeed? And what should we be expected to risk or give up? How much is enough? Also, more practically speaking, we have to consider which agents or entities should be targeted, why, and how. What would victory look like in the climate war? And assuming we, the soldiers of sustainability, prevail, what comes next? What forms and institutions should define the governments of the future? Now, in answering these questions, we must, of course, tread very carefully. We must always recognize that the means that we employ condition the ends that we obtain, and that dark actions come with a cost of the human soul, however noble the motivations may be for undertaking them. But I'm going to end now, again, AI image, just by saying that we must have hope, which itself is a radical act in these times. I, for one, believe that this war is worth fighting, and it's a war that we can win. I, for one, believe that we will find new forms of solidarity in the struggle, and that the future we are struggling for will be fairer and less oppressive than the present that we are suffering now. And I, for one, believe that while the power of the carbon axis may at times seem invincible, I know that the forces of carbon capitalism and the global state system erected to protect it are actually quite young and wholly staffed by those who do not believe in what they are doing, who are not trying to protect anything more precious than their bosses' profits or their own paychecks, and who are therefore not willing, as we must be, to sacrifice or to stay strong when faced with resistance. People like that can be defeated. We must not forget that radical change is always possible, however unlikely or remote it may seem. Not 80 years ago, much of the world was still colonies, until almost all at once people rose up to shake those chains off. Not 40 years ago, most of Eastern Europe suffered under terrible dictatorship until it did not. There's a poem I like by Bertolt Brecht that reminds us, the red part here, if you're still living, never say never. What's set in stone is not set in stone. As it is now will not remain so. For the conquered of today are the conquerors of tomorrow, and out of never comes today. We are today at the precipice of great tumult and turbulence, of conflict and change. Ours are revolutionary times. That we are becoming aware of this and of our own power in shaping the history of what is to come can only serve to unsettle the status quo and embolden those of us who would dare to resist it. That's it.
Fantastic. You're some man for one man, I have to say. Before I open up to the floor, I can't help but think and give you a companion to Bertolt Brecht. It's a line from James Conway, one of his poems. He said, our demands most modest are, we only want the earth. So very similar to what you're talking about there. Deep issues, political, very challenging. I'm sure your heads are melted, maybe a little bit of resistance. Is it really as bad as that? Are we at the stage? Revolution? Over to you. Questions or comments?